So let's label this why we need diastolic blood pressure. Okay. To answer this, we're going to look at a capillary bed where we have an arterial on one side. We will show that like that. And then on the other side, we've got our venule. We'll draw that one in blue, simply because it's going to be unoxygenated. The whole purpose of a capillary bed, when we think about capillaries, the whole purpose is fluid exchange, right? But I need you to understand what that means. It means that fluid is going to leave the blood vessel, the capillary. It's going to bathe the cells that it surrounds. It's going to deliver important nutrients. It's going to pick up metabolic waste. And then the fluid has to come back in the capillaries so that it can go back to the blood and head back up to the heart to get rid of the stuff that it just picked up. So if we think about this, a couple of key elements. Let's first build our capillary bed. All right, now we've exchanged. This is where oxygen exchange happens. This is metabolic waste pickup, all of that stuff that we just mentioned. We've got the arterial on the left, we've got the venule on the right. As such, flow is happening in this direction, right? And this is the capillary bed. Now, a couple of things I want to make sure that we mention. How do I regulate how much blood comes in here? Well, right up here, I have, this is a capillary sphincter. A sphincter is typically smooth muscle, but anyway, it's round muscle, it's circular muscle. And when the sphincter contracts, when it closes, it squeezes, and that essentially acts as a door. This capillary sphincter is the gatekeeper to let blood into this capillary bed. And I want you to think for just a second, this, I guess it's pre-capillary sphincter, as we think about what might open this door, I want you to appreciate that this has to be completely autonomous. You might think, well, maybe sympathetic or parasympathetic systems would regulate this, but that would require the entire body being innervated. You have billions, trillions perhaps, of these little precapillary sphincters that regulate all of the capillaries in your body. And we want them to be autonomous. So, what opens it up? Opened by metabolic waste. This is going to be primarily CO2 and increased acid, H+. That's what's going to open this precapillary sphincter. Now I've got blood coming in. A couple of things to note. At this point, my blood pressure, what we would consider blood pressure, we'll draw this in red at the arterial end. We're going to call this now hydrostatic pressure. This is what we're thinking about when we're thinking about our blood pressure. At the level of the arterial, we're actually at 30 millimeters of mercury. Remember, in the arm, we started at 80, but through the processes that we talked about, bifurcations and getting smaller and increased cross-section as we spread out, all of that stuff happening, we've actually dropped down to a pressure of 30 millimeters of mercury. I want to take a second to make sure we understand some of the other pressures that are acting on water at this point. And we need to list them. BCOP, that stands for blood colloid osmotic pressure. ICOP interstitial fluid, colloid osmotic pressure. And the last one, IFP, or interstitial fluid pressure. And we need to understand what generates these pressures and how it affects capillary exchange. Now, to be sure, if we look in here, right, let's take a cross section of this. What do we see? We see this capillary, and this hydrostatic pressure is a pressure that's pushing outward. Just like if you think of that as a balloon, the more water that's in the balloon, the more hydrostatic pressure it is. As you expand the volume of that water, we increase pressure, and that pressure wants to come out. It could rupture the balloon. That's the idea. What about BCOP? Okay, BCOP is blood colloid osmotic pressure. In other words, the solutes, I get it's a colloidal suspension, but this is oncotic pressure. This has a better way to think about it is osmotic pressure. This is what's pulling or pushing water based on solute gradients. And the key driver for BCOP is, of course, albumin, right? Albumin is here inside the blood, and it doesn't leave. And this generates a significant gradient for osmosis. And so BCOP is actually a pressure generated in this direction. And for healthy people under normal conditions, this value is going to be right around 28 millimeters of mercury, a significant force. And we talked about this when we introduced blood, and we talked about the role of albumin. Albumin is the most abundant protein in the blood, and this is one of its key jobs, just to be there to support this osmotic pressure pulling water back into the capillaries. Of course, the opposite is true, right? If we think about ICOP has to do with the solutes that are in the interstitial fluid. In other words, they're out here. But that's a lot of bigger area, and there aren't as many solutes, and so ICOP in and of itself is not as high of a pressure, but it is an outward pressure. And typically under normal conditions, let's assign this to 8. Now you'll find different values in different textbooks. This is a good average value, and that's just fine. The last thing that we need to think about is interstitial fluid pressure. And when we think about the interstitial fluid pressure, this is driven by the lymph. And simply put, I call this the juice box effect. Consider you got that juice box, you stick the straw in it, and then as you suck all the juice out of the box, what happens to the box? The box collapses in on itself. Why? Because your vacuum, your mouth, is sucking all of that fluid out, and as I decrease my volume, my overall pressure goes down. And so as the pressure decreases inside the box collapses. Well, that's the same thing that's going on over here. Your lymph system is an open-ended system for moving fluids. And so we have essentially a straw that's open-ended, and fluid is going up into it. And as that fluid leaves through the lymph, this creates a negative pressure out here in the interstitial space. And so IFP, it's not a big pressure. We'll give it 3, but it is in that direction. Now, if we were to add all of that up, let's give this BCOP a negative value, not because it's a negative pressure, but because it's the one going in the opposite direction. So that negative sign tells us what direction that's going. If we add all of that up, we have 41 going out, right? 30 plus 8 is 38, plus 3, there's 41. So we have a plus 41, and we have that minus 28, and that gives us a net directional pressure of 13 millimeters of mercury, and that pressure is going out. So if we apply that to our capillary bed, what do we see? We see right here, we're at 30 millimeters of mercury hydrostatic pressure, and with all that's enough with the ICOP and the IFP and the BCOP. As soon as that blood enters this capillary bed, capillaries are designed to let that fluid out because there's a net out here. That force is about 13 millimeters of mercury in the outward direction. That's what we just solved. But now we have the task of getting it back in, right? How do we get that fluid after it's done its job back in on the venous side of the capillary bed? Well, let's look at our pressures and let's see what changed, right? So that was at the venule. That was the arterial. Let's look at the venule. We have the same pressures at play. We've got hydrostatic pressure, we've got BCOP, we've got ICOP, we've got IFP. IFP, of course, that's driven by lymph. That's not going to change. That's still 3. Interstitial fluid, colloid osmotic pressure, our ICOP value. You could make the argument that because fluid went out, then that made it a little bit less concentrated. So that value might go down a little bit. But that's also going to be contrasted with the fact that if that's going down, BCOP is going up, just because we're shuttling water back and forth. And so it's easiest to think about this as these values remaining the same. ICOP is still at 8. BCOP still at that negative 28. But what about the hydrostatic pressure? Remember all of that stuff that you were yawning through that we talked about a few minutes ago. Look at what we did. We just went through this incredibly branched labyrinth of capillary beds. Not only are we running massively parallel, but with all of these capillaries added, our cross-sectional area has skyrocketed as we work through this capillary bed. And as such, our hydrostatic pressure, because it's inversely proportional to radius, resistance is, we've lost all of our resistance, and therefore we've seen a significant drop in our pressure, such that our hydrostatic pressure coming out of this bed is down to 10. Now, let's add these up. All of the pressures going out, 21. All of the pressures driving in, that's still BCOP, that's still negative 28. And what do we see? We see a net pressure of negative 7. Now remember, I don't have a negative pressure. That negative just tells me direction. In other words, this pressure wants to move back in to the capillary beds. So we see over here, we had this positive 13 out. Over here, we have this negative 7, and it's driving this fluid in. Hopefully, you're thinking, well, there's a bit of a difference. If I've got 13 going out and I've got 7 coming in, that's not enough to get all of the water that left because of the 13. And you're absolutely right. The difference, 13 minus 7, is 6. Which tells me that fluid was left out in this intracellular space. I wasn't able to recover all of it. And you'd be right. But don't forget, where's that fluid going? Aha, right there. All of that extra fluid is being pumped by the lymph back into circulation. This lymph, again, is open-ended. It's going to help clean things. It kind of gives everything a bath. And in the end, it's going to dump right back into my left subclavian vein for venous return. That's how I maintain the right amount of fluid in the interstitial space. Now, if we throw this off, let's say somebody has high blood pressure. Well, now, because their hydrostatic pressure coming in is so high, you're going to see a net movement of water out into the interstitial space. Somebody with high blood pressure, you walk in, they walk into the clinic and you look at them and you see massive swollen ankles, maybe some pit edema. It's because of all the fluid buildup in the interstitial space, because the pressure, the hydrostatic pressure coming into the system is so high, it's pushing a lot of water out and I can't get it back. That's one of the problems with high blood pressure. You might also see a scenario where you've got a sprained ankle, right? What do? We take an ACE bandage, an elastic wrap, and we wrap the ankle fairly tight. What am I doing? I'm increasing the interstitial fluid pressure. I'm essentially increasing the pressure that's forcing that fluid back into the capillaries so that it doesn't hang out in the interstitial space and cause edema. Okay, with that in mind, let's zoom out for a second and let's just appreciate what we've got going on in the entire body. If we were to, let's draw a heart. We know that coming out of the heart we have the aorta. Of course, there are branches off of the aorta, right? We've got some branches here, we've got some branches here. Eventually, we're going to branch again, and then we come to this arterial, and then we have this capillary bed, and that's just what we looked at, right? Here's our capillary bed. And then we're going to return through a venule, pick up a couple of veins coming in, and now we're back to the heart through the vena cava. Let's look at, we've got large arteries, we've got here elastic arteries, here we've got large muscular arteries, here we've got small muscular arteries and arterioles. And then over on the other side, venules, and then small veins, and then large veins. Let's look at the pressure we would typically see. We know that at its peak, the systolic pressure in the heart is going to be 120, right? But during diastole, this drops down to less than 5. And yet, the pressure in the system remains. Here, we're at 95. We've got a couple of branches, and out here, by the time I am measuring this blood pressure in a blood pressure cuff on my arm, up here we're at 90. We've got a branch. Now we're down to 80. And then as we enter the arterioles down here, we're at 30. What happened between 80 and 30? And that's something that we want to talk about in just a second. But let's finish this up. We saw just a second ago that because of the massive cross-sectional area and the massive parallel nature of capillary beds, we lose a significant amount of pressure. We come out of here at 10. And now as we start adding more capacity, we're at 8. Over here we're at 6. By the time we get back to the heart, we're at best 5. This is a closed system. And we see now the difference between the high pressure arterial side and the low pressure venule side. But let's finally come back to this question. Where is diastolic blood pressure generated? I need to have enough pressure. We saw that. This number right here is important. I need to have enough pressure in my arterioles so that I get proper capillary exchange. How do I make sure that that pressure is always there? Consider the transition from large arteries to small arteries and arterioles. And maybe let's think about this in terms of maybe an irrigation ditch, where I've got this big canal, I'm moving a lot of water, but then I have to go under a road. And under the road, the culvert that goes under the road is a smaller pipe that looks like that. Well, we know based on our discussion that as I increase the overall radius, which I just did, then resistance skyrockets. Essentially, you can think of it as all of this blood coming down, we're flowing, we're doing great. But then I hit this culvert, right? Of course, blood right in the middle, it's going to still be able to pass right through. But what does this blood do? This blood hits this wall and essentially bounces back. So now we've got this bounce back happening. That right there is your diastolic pressure. It's associated with increased resistance from decreased radius at the level of small arteries and arterioles. This is where the body can fine-tune blood pressure. Through sympathetic innervation, the body can regulate the amount of contraction of the smooth muscles surrounding these small arteries and arterioles. And as I regulate that overall diameter, that radius, you can see I've proven that that's going to have a significant effect on the overall resistance. And as I increase resistance, that's what's generating the pressure. It's all of this blood going through these big tubes and then slamming into these small tubes and not having anywhere to go and bouncing back. And now we've just understood where this diastolic blood pressure is coming from. And we understand the value of it because I have to distribute this pressure throughout capillary beds to maintain at least a 30, so that with that pressure, I can now perfuse the tissues adequately. But at the same time, I don't want to be too high, because if the pressure is too high, I won't be able to recapture that fluid on the venous side of that capillary bed, and that's going to cause problems, including decreased fluid return through the blood and increased fluid remaining stagnant in the tissues, causing edema. So if we were to sum up, we started with the question, what determines diastolic blood pressure? And for the average person measured in the arm, this is going to be about 80 millimeters of mercury. To understand this question, we have to understand the relationship between pressure, flow, and volume. Specifically, when it comes to resistance, okay? So as resistance increases, pressure increases. As flow increases, pressure increases. We see all of this in this equation, but we recognize that for the most part, there are lots of constants in that equation, and the key takeaway is that resistance is inversely proportional to the radius raised to the fourth power. The radius has a significant impact on the overall resistance. We talked about how that could change in series versus parallel, and then the importance of the total cross-sectional area in determining the overall resistance of the system. And how to maintain that, the body has to be intricately designed to make sure that for any branch point, the sizes of those arteries branching off are not a whole lot more or less than about 15% the overall reduction in radius, so that I don't affect pressure too much. Finally, all of that fluid hits the small arteries and arterioles, and that's where, through a sympathetic interaction or innervation of the smooth muscle, I can regulate the radius simply by regulating the contractile properties of the smooth muscle surrounding those small arteries and arterioles. That's how I generate diastolic blood pressure. The value of the blood pressure is in understanding capillary exchange. And we saw the forces associated with that. Hydrostatic pressure, which is what we're talking about, but also the oncotic pressure, which we divided up into blood colloid osmotic pressure, BCOP, and ICOP, with also a little bit of lymph functionality coming in with interstitial fluid pressure. We saw that we have a plus net pressure, talking about the inside, as we enter the capillary on the arterial side, and a net pressure on the back side, allowing fluid to come back into the capillary bed so that we can return it to the heart. And now we see the overall pressure system of the heart and the purpose of the heart in generating that pressure to make sure we get adequate tissue perfusion.